As scripture says, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, or simply lie in a book, so that as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. And that's what Jesus himself said. We could be led astray even if we are possibly even amongst the elect. That's a possibility. The deception could be so strong that even the elect may fall. And I was not planning on broaching this topic anymore, because now we have a true Pope, Pope Leo the 14th, an uncontested Pope. There's one only Bishop and Pope and Bishop of Rome and Vicar of Christ in the Vatican, who lives in the papal apartments, and who alone is dressed in the papal white, gives the apostolic blessing, is called Holiness for his office. But just recently, a couple of days ago, on X, formerly Twitter, and then on Facebook, there's this breaking news. A secret letter, a previously unpublished letter, sent by Pope Benedict XVI to Dom Nicola Bux, who was a very good friend, very good. He's an Orthodox, strong priest. He was member of the advisory to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Congregation for Saints, and he's a good friend of Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. And supposedly in a new book, is that a marketing ploy? A new book, the known of Dom Nicola Bux, and it's coming out in Italian, or just came out. There is, in an appendix, there's this letter sent to Nicola Bux in 2014, supposedly, and what's included is a photocopy of this supposed letter in 2014 to Nicola Bux that is included. It is so important, it's been relegated to an appendix at the back of the book. And in it, supposedly, Pope Benedict says, my resignation is complete and valid. So don't talk to me about a half resignation and the munus and the ministerium, the ministry and the office and the division, and I only resigned the ministry but not the office. But don't ask me why I'm dressed in white, called Holiness, give the apostolic blessing, sign PP, Pope and Pontiff at the end of it. Don't ask why I will be buried as Pope and, called Holiness all my life. Don't ask these difficult questions. But there's supposedly this magic letter. Now, and I really didn't want to deal with this subject because I have a whole playlist about why Benedict XVI, I started off not 100% sure, but then, in my opinion, never truly, fully, and completely resigned the office as such, the papal office as such. But simply, I'm just going to not do the Pope stuff, but I'm going to maintain the Pope stuff on the spiritual level, but not on the governance level. If you're confused with what I'm saying, I have a whole whack of videos on the Benedict XVI playlist. You can watch them. So this video I'm dealing because the point is that it appeared in Nicola Bux's book. And in that article, they say that this destroys and sets to rest all these rumors about Benedict not fully resigning. The point is that Nicola Bux himself, in 2018, so 4 years after he supposedly received that letter, which puts an end to the controversy. Well, first of all, why didn't he release it in 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and shut everybody up? He didn't. Maybe because it never existed. Maybe that's just a fake letter, computer-generated, typewritten, and who knows who signed it really, if it is even there. So unless Nicola Bux eviscerates this letter in his book, supposed letter, then I would doubt it's real. Because in 2018, so 4 years after Nicola Bux supposedly received this magic letter of Benedict, Nicola Bux himself basically doubts the resignation of Benedict, while lamenting the heresies of Francis, of Jorge Bergoglio. He says, well, maybe it's too hard to deal with the heretic pope and how to depose him and get rid of him and automatic fall from office and all that stuff. I did a whole video on it. It's probably on my list as well. And I'm going to go to the article itself, but I'm just not going to dwell too much on it. But the point is, in 4 years after he supposedly received this letter, this bombshell, hidden, secret letter, in 2018, so 4 years after, he is saying, well, we got to examine the juridical validity, meaning the legal validity of Benedict XVI's renunciation, whether it was partial or full, or even doubtful. That's 4 years after he supposedly received that letter. And then a year or two after, I think in 2020, he basically, because Benedict comes out in a book-length interview with Peter Seewald, his biographer, where he says, you know what? I'm a pope like a father is a father. I'm ontologically pope. I only gave up, so the office for Benedict, and actually you will see that in his declaratio, his declaration, not resignation, his declaration of 2013, where he renounced part of the office, basically. Because in that declaration, Benedict himself says, the office of Peter, the office of Peter is not just doing stuff. It's not governance. It's above all spiritual, and it is it has the active things, the governing things, but even more important, the spiritual, prayer and suffering. And in his last audience, he says, I gave up the governing, the powers of office for governance, but I remain in the prayer part. And then in that interview, book-length interview with Peter Seewald in 2020, published in 2020, I think the conversations were 2019 or something, he says, I'm basically ontologically pope. Like a father, I don't give up. A father can no longer not be a father. And I gave up my office, but the only part of my mandate that I kept was the spiritual mandate of the office of Peter. So basically he kept a hold of a part of, in his head, a division, a part of the office of Peter, which renders his so-called renunciation of the office null and void. You are either fully not vicar of Christ, or you are. There is no in between them. So, and then again, Nicola Bux, they asked him about this interview. Again, Nicola Bux, I'm going to show you in 2020. So that's what, 6 years after this supposed magic letter, which is now in his Nicola Bux's book as in an appendix, where it ends all these conversations about the conspiracies of the partial resignation of Benedict and basically invalidity of the pontificate of Francis. And by the way, Francis never actually called himself Pope for the first several years of his pontificate. He just refers to himself as the Bishop of Rome, because Benedict resigned as Bishop of Rome. In his head, he did the division. But yeah, so this, I really did not want to deal with this anymore because it was done. Both the two men dressed in white are dead. The true Pope Benedict died, and then we had the administrator or the apostolic administrator of the Diocese of Rome in Jorge, in the impeded see. So he was running the impeded see of Benedict, and then he passed away, and now we have an uncontested true Pope with valid cardinals, valid everything. So I said, okay, end of story, nothing more. But then this thing comes up. And this thing cannot be left unanswered. And I actually archived the two articles, one by Aldo Maria Valli, where Nicola Bux says, oh, we got to do some juridical, whether this thing is even valid, his so-called renunciation isn't even valid. I archived it, and I archived the other Nicola Bux, where he again eviscerates any division in 2019 or 2020, supposedly 6 years after this supposed letter of Benedict, just in case they want to purge the internet. And you suddenly, oh, Nicola Bux never said any of that stuff. It disappeared. It vanished. It no longer exists. No, I archived it, and I'll probably put the archive links so you can actually see them. So let us get going, because I know I already talked too much. But basically, actually, if you don't want to watch the whole video, simple solution is, this is either a fake letter or Nicola Bux is going to eviscerate it in his book, which I really doubt, because the publisher is pushing it as the end of the conversation. Even though it was just a photocopy, typewritten or computer generated, relegated to an appendix. And Nicola Bux himself, 4 years later, 2018, calls for the juridical investigation into the juridical validity of this so-called renunciation, whether it's even real or doubtful. And in 2020, again, he basically continues his attack. So what changed? Money to put it in a book and pretend the case is closed now? So the church would continue, and let's not talk about the years of Francis. Well, let's continue. So that's basically the sum of it. 4 years later and 6 years later, Nicola Bux himself calls basically this resignation most probably invalid, because he asked for in a diplomatic way, well, I should examine whether it was even valid. Was it partial? Was it full? Was it doubtful? All right, so let's get going. But that's basically the sum of it, because, yeah, I have big doubts about this validity of this so-called letter. All right, so let's get into the actual post from, it's an Italian site, the actual original. And all right, well, you can open it up. This is the translation for me. That's the English translation, Daily Compass, and they are the publishers of the book. So they are the publishers of the book. And I just mentioned this at the end of it, of the false prophets, because they themselves accuse, here it says, it also closes, like this magic letter closes the debate on who has been the true pope in recent years, a controversy that has always seemed unrealistic to rational people, to blind people who have eyes but do not see, who have brains but they do not understand. A controversy that has always seemed unrealistic to rational people, but which has unfortunately attracted many to false prophets. Who is the false prophet? Nicola Bux himself, who 4 years later asked for the juridical examination of the legal validity of the so-called renunciation? Or Nicola Bux himself, 6 years later, demolishing the false concept of Benedict that he is Pope forever. He's like a father. He's like a father in a Bavarian village who just gives the administrative functions to his son, and then his son takes care of him, and the father moves to a little house in the village, in the same compound, but his own little house. But his son takes over the management of the other part, but he's still the father. His spiritual authority is still there. Nicola Bux demolishes that thought. So, shows you anyways, this is just has to be answered. So anyways, here's the article. The unpublished letter of Benedict XVI. My resignation is complete and valid. This letter written by Pope Emeritus in August, a title which never existed in history, made up by Benedict himself. Because, again, if you watch my videos, before he chose a title for himself, the various theologians were saying, I don't know, it's kind of difficult. Maybe he can pick, the only thing he can really pick is Bishop Emeritus of the Diocese of Rome. That's it. He cannot call himself Pope Emeritus, but he chose Pope Emeritus. He chose to dress in white, give the papal blessing, be called holiness, maintain his spiritual mandate of the office without giving it up, as he himself says in 2020. Anyways, so a letter written by Pope Emeritus in August 2014 in response to objections regarding the validity and appropriateness of his resignation is published for the first time after how many years? So 2014, we're now 2025, 11 years later. Wow. Couldn't you shut us all up, 11 years ago? 10 years ago? 9 years ago? Shut us all up for spreading conspiracy theories with this magic letter? Nicola Bux or whoever? No. For the first time in a book by Monsignor Nicola Bux. Wow. Maybe I got to go buy the book now. Wow, it's in this book, so I got to go buy it. And the picture of the letter, I expanded it. Here it is. Blacked out, and it's all typewritten. Dom Bux, blah, blah. And I don't see any signature, nothing at the bottom, so I don't see the full letter. And as we know from what do you call it? Joe Biden, there's this electronic pen which mimics exactly your signature. If it is even real, if Benedict even saw this letter. And if he did, well, as I said, why has he been silent for 11 years? Well, he himself, Nicola Bux, in 2018 and 2020, demolishes the thesis of the resignation. The theological basis of Benedict's half resignation, and calls for a juridical investigation into the validity of the so-called resignation or its doubt 4 years and 6 years later after his supposed letter. So this letter was addressed to Nicola Bux. Yeah, see, that's why I have humongous doubts about this. The exceptional historical document should put an end to much sterile speculation. Well, yeah, actually bolsters it, because now you're trying to dig up a letter from 11 years ago, supposedly with Nicola Bux, who himself called for the juridical validity of the investigation in 4 years after and 6 years after. Okay, yeah, all right. To say that, now they are quoting supposedly the letter, to say that in my resignation I would have only the exercise of the ministry and not also the munus, that I left only the exercises of the ministry and not also the munus, is contrary to clear dogmatic canonical doctrine. Yes, it is contrary to clear dogmatic canonical doctrine. Did Nicola Bux himself author this letter? Because in Benedict XVI's last audience, which I mentioned a million times before, but I will not dwell on the whole thing, just on that part. Benedict XVI himself says, my amazing renunciation, I no longer have the power. He says, even though I'm doing this renunciation, that renunciation did not revoke what I have received in 2005, which is what? The munus, the office of Peter. And then he says, I'm giving up the active exercise of the ministry, but I'm maintaining the spiritual aspect, even in his last audience in 2013, which he repeated to Peter Seewald in 2020. So, to some journalists speak of a creeping schism. They do not deserve my attention. Oh, okay. This is how Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI responded to a letter dated 21 August 2014 to Monsignor Nicola Bux, former consultative member of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So he's not an idiot, Nicola Bux. He's very, very, very good priest. But I'm kind of disappointed it is included in this book, unless he's including it for historical reasons and he just demolishes it in his appendix, because it's so important. You can't even put it in the main book. You got to relegate it to an appendix. Oh, okay, well, whatever. When Cardinal Ratzinger was prefect, who had asked him about the doubts and perplexities that accompanied the resignation from the papacy the previous year. So he supposedly, according to the story, Nicola Bux in 2013 asked Benedict, so the day when he resigned, and now in 2014 he gets a response. Yet Nicola Bux in 2018 calls for the for investigation into the legal, juridical validity of the renunciation of Benedict XVI, whether it was partial or full or doubtful. Okay, this exceptional document, which for some reason we decided to hide for 11 years, okay, which should put an end to this long-standing controversy over Benedict's intentions regarding his resignation, actually just reignited them. And I hope this video basically shuts you up, because your supposed Bux himself questioned it. Is being published in full for the first time as an appendix. It is so important. We're going to put it into an appendix at the end of the book, so nobody cares. To Nicola Bux Realitae e Utopia nella Chiesa. Reality and Utopia in the Church. Written by blah blah, I don't care. In response to the objections presented to him, Benedict XVI considers the resignation of a pope to be a fully valid, and the parallelism between the diocesan bishop and the Bishop of Rome with regard to the question of the resignations is well-founded. And actually Nicola Bux himself responds to this in 2020 interview when they asked him about Benedict talking about that point and about his being ontologically pope. We'll see it. He also defends the right of a pope to speak and write outside. Well, and nobody's saying you don't have to speak and write. He's talking about his book, Jesus of Nazareth, written while he was pope, instead of course, governing the church and expelling heretic bishops and cardinals and appointing solid people. No, he spent his time writing books. Yeah, that's the function of the pope, to sit there and author books while the church burns. Okay, this letter, the existence of which, it might be his right, but was it wise? What is the right thing to do? This letter, the existence of which was known, well, I never heard of it, but which had never been published. Why do you like to keep the controversy going for years with several bishops holding the point that openly questioning the validity of Benedict's resignation? There's a Polish bishop, an American bishop, there's I think at least three public, and the numerous priests who came out doing the same thing, especially in Italy. This letter, this letter, which the existence of which was known, but which has never been published, so why did not Nicola Bux even mention it in 2018 and 2020? In order to prevent it from becoming yet another tool for fierce and pointless controversy. So you're releasing a letter which supposedly it was going to end that controversy, shut it down by the voice of Benedict XVI himself. You decided not to do it, so you won't fuel the controversy? No, you let the fire burn and expand. Is of fundamental historical importance. That's why it's just a photocopy relegated to an appendix. Okay, I needed to have it verified for reals, with actually examination of signature, exact examination of everything, and even if it is real. But I doubt it, because books never mentioned it for 4 and 6 and 10 years after. It allows us to understand Pope Emeritus' intentions regarding his resignation and the establishment of the Emeritus Pontificate, which never existed in history, making it a synodal collegial expanded office, as Gonswine in 2016 says, which of course splits the papacy, who is, according to the canon law, is in one person and one person only. As well as his broader theological vision of the papacy. It also closes the debate. Does it? Actually, it just opened it, and I drove a knife into the heart of this lie, because Nicola Bux himself, I repeated how many times now? 10 times? 4 years later and 6 years later, No, for 2018 and 2020, yeah. Basically calls for juridical examination. Doubts is true. It also closes the debate on who has been the true pope in recent years, a controversy that has always seemed unrealistic to stupid people, that's my word here, but which has unfortunately attracted many to false prophets. So I'm a false prophet for reading Benedict's exact words, for reading Gonswine's exact words, for reading in 2013, I believe, the canonist from Familia Romana University, what's his name? His name escapes me, but I reviewed he had a 10-page document on the resignation of popes and bishops and so forth. And at the end, he concludes, and it's a Pontifical University canon law professor, that Benedict only resigned what makes his resignation so unique, so different, was that he only resigned the active exercise. He limited his resignation to the exercise of the office, but not the office itself. That's from 2013 or 2014. So, yeah, I'm the stupid one. I'm the false prophet. And of course, we had the greatest of popes in Francis, of course, the most orthodox, the most zealous, the most merciful, the most open, the most prophetic pope in all of history, of course. The book includes a photocopy of the letter. So you're taking a photocopy and putting it in a book. Well, how would you take the actual letter? Alongside the text of the letter sent by Monsignor Bux, Nicola Bux. This letter contains several objections to the resignation, as well as the related risk of desacralization of the papacy. Yeah, it's just an office. Yeah, I'm bored. I'm so old, I can't handle it anymore. I'm going to resign in 2013, but I'm going to live till 2022 or 2023. Yeah, obviously you were on death's bed then. Yeah, obviously. He ran from the wolves. And then he gave the church to the wolves, to the Argentine wolf and his Sankt Gallen mafia. This letter contains several... It concludes with some critical assessments. Of Pope Emeritus's responses. Well, that's the only thing I can say. If it is a genuine letter, if it is not a fake computer generated with a fake signature, if Nicola Bux eviscerates this letter, then I might accept it as, well, that's the false opinion of Benedict, but contradicts everything else. Everything else. He was signing his name as Pope and Pontiff, PP, even while he was resigned office. When he would send letters to various bishops, he would sign Benedictus PP. While Francis never, check all the Vatican websites, Francis Jorge Bergoglio never, ever, in any document, even his so-called encyclicals, which were never addressed to the Catholic faithful, but just to the world, never, ever signed Franciscus P.P., Pope and Pontiff. Never. Because he knew he wasn't. He was just a bishop of Rome. Even in his last testament, Francis says, in my whole life and ministry as priest and bishop, not as pope. Even on his tombstone, there is no PP, just Franciscus. Just Francis. Benedict XVI is also one of the book's protagonists. Oh, now they're talking about the book, about, he talks about the book, Benedict XVI and John Paul II were the realistic ones, and then Francis was the utopian one with his Utopia. Anyways, it's about the book. This is therefore a useful short study, so buy it because we have this magic letter at the end in the appendix for understanding recent events in the church and current dynamics. In short, it's a must-read book published in Italian by La Bussola, which is that website actually. Click here to buy the book with its magic letter, which was hidden for 11 years because... Why? Oh, so we won't spread the the controversy, but that letter ends the controversy. You're contradicting yourselves. Ricardo, you're contradicting yourself. Anyways, so this is the official letter. It was on the internet. Oh, Rome reports it, and I don't know who else reports it. Wow, the magic letter which ends the debate. Wow, why was it? Okay, well. All right, so I'm going to go through the documents which I mentioned as fast as I can. But again, if you watch my videos and don't go, wow, latest scandal, heretic priest says this. Ooh, latest scandal, bishop does that. Ooh, latest scandal. Like, really, who cares? We're done with that garbage. We're done with that garbage. Okay? So, and I know people don't have time to, they don't have attention span anymore, unfortunately. And that's why my channel just stuck there. People don't have time to spend an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours learning anything. They just want 5-minute videos. All right, that's fine. I don't care. So here's the declaratio, the declaration, not resignation, my declaration to you people. Benedict XVI, 2013, February, my declaration, my declaratio. So he talks about, again, my other videos delve into this way more, much more. So, but I'm just doing it to connect the dots, to show you that Benedict himself says, I'm not really giving up the office. I'm just giving, the ministry part, the power for governance, as he says in his last audience. But I'm staying there anyways. That's why I'm dressed in white anyways. So, I don't have, I'm getting old, man, and I just don't have the adequate exercise ability, no longer suited for the adequate exercise of the Petrine ministry. And in Latin, it is the ministerium. I don't have, no, the Petrine office, actually. Well, let's see here. Cool. Here we go. Hoc munus. Oh, no. So before, Ministerio Episcopi Romani, Petrium atque munus Petrinum. So this is the munus. He talks about actually the munus, the office, adequate exercise of the office. So he never resigns the office, but what he says in the last audience, the active exercise of the office. This ministry, due to its essential spiritual nature, which is here, it is actually this office. I'm very conscious that this munus, this office, who essentially is spiritual, but not only, and it's not just activity, like in the English here it says, so is not this office, due to its essential spiritual nature, must be carried out not only with words and deeds, which is the power of a governance of the office, but no less with prayer and suffering. Patiendo et orando here, patiendo et orando, which he maintains. He says in 2020 that I maintain that part of my mandate. A mandate is given in an office. So he never gave up that part of the office. Prayer and suffering. And he says actually in his last audience, beside the cross of Christ in prayer and suffering because he's next to the cross. So he says, I renounce the ministry, the ministerium. So here it is. Ministerio Episcopi Rome. So he's giving up the ministry, the active part, the doing stuff part of the office. So I'm renouncing the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, not the Vicar of Christ. Just the Bishop of Rome. That's why Jorge Bergoglio, so-called Francis, he, for the first several years, just called himself Bishop of Rome, Bishop of Rome, Bishop of Rome. Finally, he was forced to call himself Pope. Years later, I think during Amoris Laetitia, or I'm the Pope, I said so. Okay, yeah. Successor of Peter, entrusted to me by the cardinals on April 19th, 2005. So he renounces the ministry. And then Benedictus PP, 16th. So if you look, you always see Franciscus, but you never see the PP. He knows who he is and who he is not. Okay? So he's giving up. He talks about the office being the munus, which is munus petrinum, and this munus, which is essentially spiritual. But, so it's not just actions and words, but prayer and suffering. And this he received in 2005 from the hands of from the cardinals, which of course he accepted. And I'm stressing this because in his last audience, Benedict himself will say that my renunciation. So you want to understand what he meant by his declaration, by his declaratio? He tells you in his last audience that my renunciation of the active exercise, not the passive exercise, but the active exercise of the ministry. And he actually compares himself to Benedict, Saint Benedict, who says whether it was passive or active, he remains. So it's the same. And he maintained his papal name of Benedict. So he says here, because he will say in his last audience that what he received in the cardinals in 2005, his renunciation does not revoke what he received in 2005. How come? Didn't you renounce the office? Therefore, it does revoke that. So you are no longer part of the office, period. End of story. You have given up the office. But he says, no, my renunciation does not revoke this. I remain always and forever beside Christ under his cross. And this, it does not revoke what I received in 2005. That's why I'm stressing it. Again, if you want me to babble more, you can go watch my videos. So this is his general audience, Benedict XVI's general audience, 27 February 2013. So what is that? 13, 23, 16 days later. All right? So I'm not going to dwell on the whole thing because I'm just going to dwell on the points. So when on April 9, that's Benedict speaking, so who's the interpreter of his own declaration? The author of the declaration, Benedict himself. So when on 19 April, nearly 8 years ago, I accepted the Petrine ministry. So he accepted the Petrine munus. I wonder if it is, well, he spoke in Latin, so I'm not sure if they use ministerium or munus. It doesn't really matter. Because in this case, it doesn't really matter. Here, allow me to go back once again to 19 April 2005. So he's stressing this. The real gravity of the decision was also due to the fact. So the gravity of his decision, his declaration, to renounce the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. But remember, the munus petrinum is primarily spiritual. So it includes actions and words and prayer and suffering. But so he tells you, again, he repeats that a second time. Then once again, let's go back to 2005 when I received the munus petrinum. The real gravity of the decision was due to the fact that from that moment, from him receiving the munus petrinum, I was engaged always and forever by the Lord. Always, anyone who accepts the Petrine munus no longer has any privacy. He is always so basically he says, I don't want to go through the whole thing, but basically he says, I'm always and forever. The always is also forever. There can no longer be a return to the private sphere. Why not? If you gave up the office, you are no longer the vicar of Christ, you're no longer the Bishop of Rome, you can become just Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Again, Ratzinger. You can go back to live in a monastery or an apartment in Bavaria, play your piano with your cats and other books, and give lectures to your fans. Why not? Continuing here. Remember, he just talked about the 2005. He brings it up, receiving the munus petrinum, the office of Peter, which is both spiritual and active. He says this is always and forever. And then he says, The always is also forever. There can no longer be a return to a private sphere. My decision to resign what? The munus Petrinum, the office of Peter? No, the active exercise of the munus. The active exercise, I'm giving up my resigning, the active exercise of the munus, of the office, does not revoke this always and forever, which he received in 2005 from the hands of the cardinals. I do not return to private life, to real travel, blah, 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 abandoning. I am not abandoning the cross. And that's basically a word for the office of Peter. But remaining in a new way. In a new way, which I invented at the side of the crucified Lord. I no longer bear the power of office for. So he didn't say, I no longer bear the office. I'm done. I just gave up the munus. I no longer bear the munus, at least after the 28th of February, whatever the date was. I no longer bear the office. I will no longer bear the office. I will no longer have the office. So, of course, the power of that office, I don't have. I don't have anything. I'm no longer. But he says, first of all, remember, he says, his resignation to resign, the active exercise of the office does not revoke his acceptance of the office in 2005, which is always and forever. And I no longer bear the power of office for governance. So the active exercise for the governance of the church. But I maintain the power of the office in the service of prayer. In the service of prayer. I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure of Peter, in the office of Peter, so to speak. And he told you in his declaration that the office of Peter is, we went through it already, is not only doing and writing and governing, but prayer and suffering and prayer. So it is, and it's above all spiritual. He tells you here exactly his interpretation of his declaration, that his acceptance of the munus Petrinum in 2005 from the hands of the cardinals is always and forever. And his decision to resign the active exercise of the office of the munus does not revoke his acceptance of the office in 2005, which is always and forever. And he cannot go to private life because he still have part of the office. But he doesn't bear the power of the office of the munus for governance, because he gave it up, the active exercise. But in the service of prayer, so he maintains the spiritual mandate, as he himself says in 2020 book published by Last Testament, I think it's called, or Conversations by Peter Sewald, his own biographer. He says, I only maintain the mandate of the office, the spiritual mandate, which he tells you here. So he did not resign the office. So Francis cannot be Pope because the office was occupied. As in the movie Highlander, there can only be one. So, and he tells you, I remain, so to speak, in the enclosure, the office, the munus of Peter. And he continues, Saint Benedict, listen to the words, whose name I bear as Pope. I bear as Pope, which he bore as Pope. So the day he died, and on his tombstone it says Benedictus XVI, Pope and Pontiff. So he was always Pope, and he was lived as Pope and buried as Pope. Saint Benedict, whose name I bear as Pope, will be a great example for me in this. He showed us the way for a life which, whether active or passive, is completely given over to the work of God. So this is the interpretation, the authentic interpretation of the author of the declaration. And in 2016, Archbishop Gerhard Gonschwein his Benedict XVI personal secretary for years, decades. In 2016, then afterwards he said, after the controversy, oh, I said there's only one Pope and it's Francis. Yeah, it's one is. But listen to you misinterpreted me. No, actually, Gonswine here in the lecture and the speech, promoting a book talking about Benedict inventing this. He is basically introducing a book. Again, I analyzed the speech fully in other videos, so I'm not going to do that now. But this is important. That's in 2016. So basically, we've seen Benedict himself in his Declaratio saying it, in his interpretation of his own renunciation, telling you exactly what he did. Gerrit Gonswine, his own personal secretary, who was with him till the last moment, tells you. Archbishop Gerrit Gonswine's expanded Petrine office speech. He tells you Benedict expanded the Petrine office into a new papacy, a collegial synodal type of a papacy that includes the passive part and the active part, the one who's doing the governance. But that office is expanded because Benedict remained Pope. He did not give up the office. Gonswine, his own personal secretary, tells you that. And Benedict himself basically said that. It is in his own actions and life. Francis, every time he picked cardinals, brought them to Benedict. They kneeled before him, they kissed his hand, and they received the papal blessing. It was a choreographed double blessing. Benedict and Francis did the blessing of, the expanded Petrine office, the collegial synodal office. Okay. So I'm not going to go, of course, through the whole thing. I'm just want to show you the highlights, which deal with this question. A question which I thought I was never, ever going to talk about again. But here it is. Remember, this Archbishop Gonswine, 2016, so 3 years after the so-called resignation of Benedict. He tells you, actually here, I forgot to highlight this line. Yeah, let's actually expand, make it bigger, magnify. All right, before and after his resignation, Benedict understood and understands, that's 2016, his task as participation in such a Petrine office, in a Petrine ministry. He tells you here, Benedict, has left the papal throne where, the governance part happens, and yet, with the step made on February 11th, 2013, he has not at all abandoned this ministry, this office. How much more explicit do you need to be? You misunderstood me. No. Instead, what did Benedict do? He has complemented the personal office. It is it's a one-person deal, with a collegial and synodal dimension as a quasi-shared ministry. Which, of course, again tells you he never really fully resigned the office, which means the office is occupied, which means Francis was never the vicar of Christ. He might have been the Bishop of Rome, the apostolic administrator of the impeded see of Benedict. But that's it. And then he says here, maybe I'll expand this part too. Just for funsies, huh? Since the election of his successor, Francis, on March 13th, 2013, there are not therefore two popes, but de facto an expanded office, an expanded ministry, with an active member who does the governing part, because Benedict himself said in his last audience that he gave up the power of office for governance, but he remains in the spiritual, with an active member and a contemplative member. A de facto expanded office, a shared ministry, a shared office, one doing the work and one doing the prayer. This is why, and now for all of you who wonder, why should I expand it? Let's see if it screws up the thing. Why was Benedict, we're so confused. Why is Benedict still wearing white? Why is he called holiness? Why does he still live in the Vatican? We're so confused, but from 2016, Gonswine explicitly told you why. He just told us it's an expanded office. He has not at all abandoned this office, this ministry, which he received in 2005. And since 2013, we have not a de facto, since the election of Francis, we have a de facto expanded office with an active member and a contemplative member. This is why Benedict XVI has not given up his name, his papal name of Benedict, or the white cassock. This is why the correct name by which to address him, Benedict, even today in 2016, after he so-called renounced, after they gave up the office supposedly, is Your Holiness. And this is also why he has not retired to a secluded monastery, but within the Vatican. And then in the 2020 book of Peter Seewald, Benedict will say, well, it's like a Bavarian village, and the father, gives up the active exercise, the running of the business to his son, and he retires into a small farmhouse in the same vicinity. So this is exactly what he did. And he's a father. His spiritual mandate is still there. He is a father forever. He's ontologically father. So now you know why. And that's why Benedict gave the papal blessing, the apostolic blessing. That is why Benedict, when he wrote letters to bishops or priests or something, signed his name Benedictus PP, Pope and Pontiff, even while he was resigned. Because that is why Benedict received a papal funeral. That is why Benedict was buried in St. Peter's in the tomb of John Paul II as Pope, and his tombstone saying Benedictus PP, Pope and Pontiff. That is why Francis brought cardinals to receive his blessing and kiss his ring. Now you know, because he never fully resigned the office of Peter as such, which renders the office occupied. Therefore, Francis was never, ever in the office of Peter, but simply as the Bishop of Rome. Oh yeah, he's talking about Rigoli. Rigoli is the author of this book, which is he's talking about. But I'm not. Again, 35 years later, listen to this again. Like, you cannot misunderstand Gonswine. He was just backtracking. Oh my God, people actually know the truth now. I got to pretend I was misinterpreted. 35 years later, he's talking about Benedict. He has not, that's what the third time he repeats it, he has not abandoned the office of Peter. Something which would have been entirely impossible for him, for Benedict, after his irrevocable acceptance. Irrevocable acceptance of what? The office in April 2005, which is exactly what Benedict XVI said in his last audience, where he said, my renunciation of the active exercise did not revoke what I have received in 2005, which is the office of Peter, the munus petrinum. I was watching the election of Pope Leo XIV, and the cardinal running the conclave, he talks about receiving the munus petrinum. What more do you want? What more proof do you need? And I think this is basically the point I wanted to show. Like, it is indisputable. It is indisputable. And the false prophets are those who lie and tell us that Francis was a true pope, that Francis was the vicar of Christ, that Francis had any authority. He had zero authority. His encyclicals are not even really encyclicals. I have a video calling the fake encyclicals of Francis because they do not amount to what an encyclical traditionally is. Never addressed to cardinals, bishops, Catholics. No, it's just to the world, to the environment, to whatever. Now here's the Nicola Bux. 4 years. 2018. You can look at the date up there. 2018, 13th of October 2018, published on the website of Aldo Maria Valli in Italy. Very well known Vaticanist. And he interviews Nicola Bux about the crisis in the church, the crisis of truth with Francis. And they're talking about, if heresy, a heretic pope, Nicola Bux says automatically falls from the office, but how do we enforce that? And it's a big, long, and I did a big article, probably it's entitled maybe Crisis of Faith, Nicola Bux, whatever it is, in one of my videos. And then in that, and he says the title, I guess, Unity is Achieved in Truth. In that, he talks, so I'm not going to go through heresies and how to do this, just a section on, after all the controversy, it's like, how do we judge it and who's going to declare it and blah, blah, blah. He says, well, it is, the Aldo Maria Valli tells Nicola Bux, yeah, I know this. So basically there's a ton of difficulties. There's a lot of difficulties. So Nicola Bux says, yeah, I mean, how do we depose him? Do the cardinals declare him a heretic, declare the seat empty, vacant, and it might cause more problems by electing another pope? Then we go into like the Great Western Schism with like 2, 3, 4 popes at the same time. And so at the end of the article, Nicola Bux, who supposedly had this magic letter 4 years previous, which is supposedly to end the false prophets promoting the idea that Benedict never resigned. Here's what Nicola Bux himself says. The author says, in short, many practical difficulties. So Nicola Bux says, perhaps, and I say this precisely from a practical standpoint. So instead of having to deal with a heretic pope in Francis, so from a practical standpoint, it would be easier to examine and study more carefully the question of the juridical validity, the legal validity. Could it be invalid? Of Pope Benedict XVI's resignation. That is whether his so-called renunciation is full or partial, halfway, as some have said, or doubtful. Since the idea of a sort of collegial papacy, an expanded Petrine office, as Gonschwein himself says, seems to me decidedly contrary to the dictates of the gospel and to the code of canon law, and as the supposed letter of Benedict itself says, which is true, which basically you condemn yourself. Well, you don't condemn yourself. Basically, you say, oh, yeah, I was always Pope, so tough luck. In fact, Jesus did not say, I will give you keys, addressing Peter and Andrew, but only Peter. This is why I say that perhaps an in-depth study of the resignation could be more useful and fruitful. Because why? Because if it turns out that the resignation was partial, not full, or doubtful, it would render it null and void, and then we can clearly say, well, Francis was never Pope. So end of story. That makes it way easier than having to deal with a heretic Pope. As well as helping to overcome problems that today, that's in 2018, during the glorious reign of Francis, Jorge Bergoglio, the Argentinian Pope, seems insurmountable. So I'm going to just read that part again. So after dealing with all heresies and blah, 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 perhaps, and I say this precisely from a practical standpoint, it would be easier to examine and study more carefully the question of the juridical legal validity of Pope Benedict XVI's resignation. That is, whether it was full or partial or doubtful. Or doubtful. This is the man who supposedly had that magic letter 4 years before. Huh? That's Aldo Maria Valli's interview with Nicola Bux, October 13th, 2018. Then, in 2020, Pope Benedict, I'm going to move my face just for a second here. Pope Benedict, this was published. Why is this not expanding like it was? Why is this doing... Oh, here we go. May 6, 2020. So what, 6 years after the supposed letter? We'll see what book says. Because they're talking here about a book by Peter Sewald, the authorized biographer of Benedict, in which Benedict says, Pope Benedict, I resigned, but I kept the spiritual dimension, the part of the office which is, he told you at the beginning in his declaratio, the papacy, the munus petrinum, the office of Peter, is not just doing stuff. It's primarily spiritual. It's the governance and the prayer, the spiritual dimension, which he kept this. And he says the office, munus petrinum, in his declaratio of Benedict XVI, is primarily a spiritual office. And he kept... Oh yeah, he resigned the office, but I kept the spiritual dimension of the papacy, which means he kept the main part of the papacy. Again. Like, I mean, now what does he say here? In a new biography, Pope Benedict speaks about the spiritual dimension of the papacy, which is alone still my mandate. Still my mandate. And... what's a mandate? What's a mandate? It's an official order or commission to do something. The authority to carry out a policy or course of action regarded as given by the electorate to a candidate or a party that is victorious in an election. So the mandate he received in 2005 on April 19th, was it? From the cardinals. This is the mandate of the munus petrinum. So he's maintaining that spiritual mandate of the munus petrinum. So it says here in his discussion with Peter Sewald, he says, his own understanding of the resignation was that he speaks in this book about the spiritual dimension, which is alone still my mandate. And we discussed it that in the declaration, well, I'll show you again, that the Petrine munus, in the Latin, the office, this munus, due to its essential spiritual nature. So its essential spiritual nature, and here he says, the spiritual dimension, which is alone still. So he had it, and it is still my mandate. The spiritual dimension of the munus petrinum, of the office of Peter, is still his mandate. So he never gave it up. He shows an understanding of his resignation from the papacy, according to which he gave up any concrete legal powers, which we showed you in his last audience, where he says, well, I no longer have the power of governors, power for governance of the office, but I still maintain the prayer and the suffering. And whatever I renounced, the active exercise, which is the power for governance, did not revoke what I received in 2005. Like, crystal clear. I never gave up the office. I never gave up the munus petrinum, which Gaussmann himself reiterated 50 billion times in his speech. That he gave up, according to which he gave up, he shows an understanding of his resignation from the papacy, according to which he gave up any concrete legal powers, power of governance of the office, not the office, and any role of governance, but at the same time maintained the spiritual mandate, which is the most essential part of the office, according to Benedict himself in his declaration, in his declaration. And then he says, Benedict says at the end of up to the end of the Second Vatican Council, no bishops ever resigned, which is true, because that was a novelty of Paul VI, the destroyer of the Roman Rite. He introduced resignation of bishops at the end of age 75, which is actually the Code of Canon Law. It doesn't order them to do so. It requests that they submit the resignation. Request, please. But suppose I don't. What, are you going to depose me? If I'm a bishop, I said, no, I don't care. The code says I'm requested to submit my resignation, but I'm not going to. I think I'm the father of this diocese. I'm not resigning. I'm maintaining the 2,000-year tradition of the church. I'm not resigning because I reach a certain arbitrary age limit. What are you going to do? Oh, same thing with the banning of cardinals from participating in the conclave after the age of 80. Again, a political maneuver of Paul VI to eliminate the traditionalist conservative cardinals for the election of his successor. That's why it was done. Not for any real reason. We don't want the wisdom of the ancients, which Jorge Francis in the document in the Amazonian says, we don't got to listen to the ancestors, the wisdom of the spirits of the ancestors, the wisdom. Well, you have living wisdom in the old cardinals. No, let's eliminate them. Let's come to them new guys. New blood in town. Novelty. So he says, well, you got two novelties. Hey, I'm going to add another one. I'm going to invent one out of thin air. Not just resignation. I'm going to invent the Pope Emeritus thing. It is here that Pope Benedict then draws a comparison with the papacy. For such a retired bishop, he adds, does not anymore actively have an episcopal seat, but he remains a bishop, right? But still finds himself in a special relationship to a former bishop to his seat. In a sense, why? But again, traditionally a bishop was there till he was dead, or deposed for heresy. Other than that, or insanity or something. Other than that, he was the father of the diocese. He was the Christ of that church. This retired bishop, however, thereby does not become a second bishop of his diocese. While you're confusing a bishop and an office now, Benedict, explains Benedict. That's in 2020 to Peter Seewald. Such a bishop has fully given up his office, yet the spiritual connection with his former seat was not being acknowledged. Also as a legal, has now been acknowledged also as a legal quality. Anyways, thus, he continues, there are not two bishops. Actually, in fact, there are. It depends on what you mean by bishops, Benedict. Yes, there are two bishops. They are both bishops. They're not bishops. But one is holding the office for the diocese, for the bishops. For the bishop of that diocese, he still has control. The other one, bishop, has been thrown into pasture because Paul VI of unhappy memory decided to not invent, to turn bishops into employees and force them to retire, except the Bishop of Rome. The Bishop of Rome gets to stay. But all you other bishops, I'm going to force you to get out of here. Yeah, there are no two governing bishops. Well, there are two bishops, Benedict. But one with a spiritual mandate, why would he have a spiritual mandate? He's been removed from his diocese. He no longer has a spiritual mandate. It is not conceivable why such a legal concept should not also be applied to the Bishop of Rome. Pope Benedict explicitly states, thus making it clear that according to his own idea, he fully resigned the papal office, not really, while maintaining the spiritual dimension of the office. So I'm going to give up the office, but he explicitly says, that's why he was dressed in white, called Benedict, papal name, buried as Pope, lived as Pope, gave the papal blessing, signed PP, called holiness, lived in the Vatican. It's all explained because he kept the papal office. He did not abandon the office, something which was impossible for him to do after his irrevocable acceptance of the office. How many times do we have to say that? So he maintained the spiritual dimension of the office, which is the main part of the office according to him, which means he never resigned the office in full as such. He just gave up the active exercise of the office, which means he gave up the active exercise of the power for governance, as he himself says, but not the rest of the office. And then they ask him, why don't you intervene in Amoris Laetitia and other things? He says, that would lead too much into the concrete area of church governance, and therefore would leave the spiritual dimension, which alone is still my mandate. He explained that in 2013 in his last audience. He gave up the power for governors, but maintained the spiritual mandate of the office, which his renunciation did not revoke what he received in 2005, which he himself said, and which Begonstein himself said, which is the main part of the Munus Petrinum, which Benedict himself says in his Declaratio of 13 February 2013. It is still his mandate, which he received in 2005. The mandate of the Munus Petrinum, of the office of Peter. It's still his mandate. Further discussing this matter of a retired pope with Peter Sewald, Benedict makes a comparison with the change of generations. Oh, this is what I was talking previously about. Where the father of a family gives up his legal status, the legal powers. As I said, this canon law professor in 2013 or 14, which I analyzed his letters at the Pontifical University, says the novelty of Benedict's renunciation that he only renounced the exercise of the office without the office itself being resigned. He said that. A professor at the Pontifical University teaching canon law. So he gave up the legal status. So here again, Benedict makes a comparison with the change of the generations, where the father of a family gives up his legal status while maintaining his human spiritual importance, which remains until death. That is to say, the functional aspect, the power for governance, the active exercise, the doing stuff part of the papacy, the functional aspect of the fatherhood can change. But his ontological part, not his so the functional That is to say, the functional aspect of the fatherhood can change, not his ontological part. So for Benedict, he is ontologically Pope. He is Pope incarnate. He is not Pope, even though he gave up the legal part, the active exercise, the power of governance of the office, but not the office itself, not the fatherhood. He gave up the legal functions of the father, the exercises of the fatherhood, but not the fatherhood, which means he did not leave the office. Here the former Pope refers to a Bavarian farming families where, listen to this because it mimics exactly what he did. The father of a family at some point in his life hands over the major farmhouse to his son. Like as Gonswein says, he says, Benedict did not leave he moved to the side, making room for his successor. So the father of a family at some point in his life hands over the major farmhouse to his son while staying in a smaller cottage, like Benedict, on the same land, like Benedict in the Vatican at his Mater Ecclesiae monastery. I think that's what it's called. The son then becomes responsible for providing the father with his material needs, such as food. Thus, Benedict argues, his material independence is given, just as the transition of the concrete rights to the son. So he gives them the rights to run things. That means the spiritual side of the fatherhood remains. The spiritual side of the munus petrinum remains, which means he did not give up the munus petrinum. All the situation changes with regard to the concrete rights and duties. So the power of governance, the active exercise, yeah, I'm giving that up, but I'm still the father here. I'm still the Pope here. I'm not giving up that part of the munus petrinum, which is the most essential, as Benedict himself said. So that's in 2020. So LifeSite reached out to Monsignor Nicola Bux, who has this hidden letter for 11 years, now just published in an appendix with a photocopy of it. In his new book, so buy the book. LifeSite reached out to Monsignor Nicola Bux in 2020, 9 years after he supposedly got this magic ladder. A Vatican theologian and former collaborator of Pope Benedict XVI, as a consultor to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, because he has made in the past some remarks about the juridical validity of Pope Benedict XVI's renunciation, whether it was partial or full, whether it was even doubtful. We dealt with that already. That was 2 years previous. After LifeSite had summed up for him the new statements by Pope Benedict, as it can be found in the new papal biography, Monsignor Bux answered saying, in my opinion, one of the most problematic aspects would be the idea implicit in Pope Ratzinger's act that the papacy is not a single indivisible office, but on the contrary, a divisible office that can be unpacked. I'll keep the spiritual mandate, but I'm going to give up the governing mandate. In the sense that a pope may choose to give up some functions, keeping for himself others, which is exactly what Benedict did. Which means he kept he never renounced the office as such. He renounced just the exercise of the office, which would not then be passed on to his successor. A clearly erroneous idea. So I think Canon 188 talks about a resignation done out of error would render the resignation null and void. Anyways, we dealt with the canons, various canons, and then you actually have to resign the office, not its actual functions. Again, I can't remember 236 number 2. I did a ton of videos on that stuff, so you can, if you're interested in the story. Anyways, In further exchanges with Monsignor Bux, this Italian theologian added the following. Now here's the question about, oh, well, the papal office, I'm going to give it up like a bishop gives up the office in his diocese. But Benedict talks about the papal office as being ontological. It's an always and forever. A father is always the father, even though he gave up some of the governing functions to his son. But he's still the father. He maintains the spiritual mandate of the munus petrinum, of the fatherhood, of the Pope, which means father. The comparison of the papal office with the episcopal office, in what regards the abdication of papal office, is not correct. The episcopal office is conferred by episcopal ordination or consecration, imprinting an indelible character on the soul of the bishop. Thus, while he may, like the bishop, may be relieved of a particular pastoral responsibility, he remains always a bishop. The papal office is conferred by the acceptance of the election to the See of Peter, that is to say, by an act of the will. It doesn't endow you with an indelible mark. It's not an eighth sacrament. It's an act of the will of the person elected, accepting the call to be the vicar of Christ on earth. Not just the Bishop of Rome, because Peter was the vicar of Christ. He was both vicar of Christ and Bishop of Antioch. And then when he left Antioch, he was still the vicar of Christ, but no longer the Bishop of Antioch. So we have almost a similar situation here. Francis being the Bishop of Rome, but Benedict maintaining the fatherhood, which is always and forever, maintaining the spiritual mandate of the office, which he still maintains, is still the vicar of Christ. From the moment that the person elected consents, he has the full jurisdiction of the Roman pontiff. Monsignor Nicola Bux continues, if the person elected is not a bishop, Monsignor Bux continued, he must be immediately consecrated a bishop because the papacy entails the exercise of the episcopal office. But he is pope from the moment of consent. Even if he's not a bishop, even if he's a layman, he becomes pope at the moment of consent to the election. If the same person at a certain point declares that he can no longer fulfill the call to be not just the Bishop of Rome, the exercise of the ministry, but the vicar of Christ on earth, he loses the papal office entirely and totally, and returns to the condition in which he was before giving the consent to be vicar of Christ on earth, meaning Benedict XVI would become Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger again. End of story. Very simple. He's no longer Pope, period, emeritus or non-emeritus. Here the Italian theologian explains the fundamental principle that the papacy is not conferred by sacramental grace. It does not imprint an indelible character upon the soul. To the one who consents to be pope and perseveres in the consent, the grace is given. That's why Jorge never had that grace. As our Lord promised to be the perpetual visible source and foundation of the unity both of the bishops and of the whole community of the faithful. Lumen Gentium number 23. Such a grace, by its very definition, is given to only one person at any given time. Since Benedict did not give up, but still maintained the spiritual mandate of the munus petrinum, he did not give up the office. That's why the grace of office was still with him and not with Jorge Bergoglio, aka Francis, the most humble pope in history. In conclusion, Monsignor Nicola Bux writes, our Lord gave Peter a single mandate, legal and spiritual at the same time. So you can't divide, I'm going to give up the legal aspect, but I'm going to keep the spiritual aspect of the office, as Benedict explicitly said many, many times up to 2020. I'm going to repeat this. Our Lord gave Peter a single mandate, legal and spiritual, at the same time, and asked the apostles to support him through communion, cum ed sub Petro, with and under Peter. St. Paul explains its care for all the churches. Therefore, there is no Petrine primacy to share. There is no Petrine primacy to share, but two indissoluble principles in permanent communion with one another, the Petrine primacy and the episcopal teamwork, collegiality. So this is, that was, again, Monsignor Nicola Bux basically hammering Benedict. But magically, 11 years later, we have this magic ladder. It's in Nicola Bux's book, in an appendix, a photocopy of that supposed real ladder. Well, unless Nicola Bux eviscerates it like here and previously, and actually reiterates the call for an examination, whether this Benedict's resignation was juridically valid, whether it was halfway or even doubtful, then I would lose respect for Nicola Bux. But just to show you this big probability that this letter is a fraud. And actually in 2019, again, there's a quote here from Benedict. I just wanted to show it to you. It's not essential, but anyways. Then some 4 years later, so in 2020, reflecting on his abdication in a book interview with, again, Peter Seewald, entitled that's a different book, Last Testament, Benedict XVI said, my step was not one of taking flight, meaning leaving, escaping, but was precisely another way of remaining faithful to my ministry, my office, after he resigned 4 years before. And then it tells you about the Munus Ministerium, which we dealt with in the actual declaration of Francis, of Benedict, to finish off, to end it, to complete the story. Here is the picture of Pope Benedict, his tomb, as in. He dressed in white, he was called Holiness, he was called Pope, he gave the papal blessing. Cardinals were brought to him to receive the papal blessing from him by Francis. He signed his name, Benedictus PP, as you see here in the picture, on his letters, Pope and Pontiff. And Francis never did. He received the papal funeral, buried in St. Peter's Basilica, in the tomb of John Paul II. And here is his tombstone, Benedictus, Pope and Pontiff, the 16th. If he was not Pope and Pontiff, it should be just Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Pope till 2013 or something. Compare that to the tombstone. Oh, Pope Francis, his last testament. I had a video on his last testament. He tells you explicitly he says, all I want on my tombstone is just Franciscus. That's it. Don't. I only want Franciscus, and that's it. What he signed in every letter, in every encyclical, in every decree, just Francis. Your buddy Francis. Not even Bishop of Rome, just Francis. Like, Cher or Madonna. I'm just Francis. Never signed PP, never Pope and Pontiff, ever. And he tells you, and the first several years of his pontificate, he just referred to himself as the Bishop of Rome. He totally resisted being called Pope for years. Just Bishop of Rome. And then here in his deathbed, he just wants Francis. That's it. What he lived like. And even here, in his own last testament, he just signs it Francis. 2020, just Francis. That's it. What he always signed, just Francis. And he says here, throughout my life, and during my ministry as priest and bishop. No pope. This is his ministry as priest and bishop. Francis tells you. Just priest and bishop. And here's the picture of his tombstone there. Where are you? Come on up. There we go. There's somebody's criticizing how it is. The inscription is not even correct. It's off-centered. Well, you got what you deserve. And here's the Franciscus. That's it. At least Benedict has the PP, Pope and Pontiff, even though he supposedly was no longer Pope. But he was lived as Pope, died as Pope, buried as Pope, got the papal funeral, buried as Pope. So here's, he talks about the spacing. Somebody's complaining. Look, this is so disrespectful. Franciscus. F-R-A nis space between a U and S. Franciscus. Well, yeah, they took real good care about, etching his name into his tombstone. So this is what I wanted to show you. Even on his tombstone, it's just Francis. Yet, Benedict himself, who supposedly resigned the office, buried Benedictus the 16th, Pope and Pontiff. Pope and Pontiff. P. Pope and Pontiff. And that's all I have to say. That's everything I gotta say. I know I haven't been doing videos, but I'll be doing one soon on a review actually of a book I'm reading. So I'm in no rush. But I hope you enjoyed this video and you can show that, Benedict never resigned the office as such. He himself says so. Gonswein says so. He maintained the most important part of the office, which is the spiritual part. He still maintained the mandate he received, the spiritual mandate he received in 2005, till the day he died. So he never really fully resigned the office, which means the office was occupied, the munus petrinum was occupied, and no one else can occupy an occupied office. That's it, that's all. I have nothing more to say except like, share, and subscribe, and comment on the video downstairs below it, and I'll see you next time soon, I hope. All right, bye-bye.